Look at that disgusting animal. Someone call security before that trash begs for our leftovers. 5 elite socialites in designer silk dresses stood outside Luxor restaurant, laughing, pointing, sneering at the ragged man pressed against the wall. They saw a filthy beggar, torn clothes, mud crusted into his skin, someone beneath their notice, someone to mock on their way to a $500 brunch. What they didn't know, what nobody on that street knew, was that the man standing in silence was Yul Bakjin, 38 years old, the most lethal syndicate boss in 2 cities. A man whose fortune could have bought the restaurant, the block it sat on, and every woman laughing inside it. His name alone made grown men look away. Yet here he stood in rags by his own choice, because every woman who had ever smiled at him asked the same 3 questions before she ever asked his name. How much? How big? How soon? So he had stripped off the tailored suit, the platinum watch, the armor of his empire, and walked into the cold as nobody at all, just to find out if a single soul could love the man underneath the money. He expected cruelty. He got it. What he didn't expect was Patricia Edmond, a broke, exhausted waitress who hadn't eaten since her shift started, to step directly between him and 5 sets of designer heels, risking the only job keeping her family alive, and press a warm loaf of bread into his hands bought with her last tip money. He didn't know yet that this single act of mercy was about to collide with a war he hadn't started, a betrayal he hadn't seen coming, and a child he wouldn't know existed until it was almost too late. If you believe real love can find a man even when he looks like he has nothing left, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, hit that like button, and subscribe so you never miss where this story goes. Now let's go back to the morning it all began. The sun hadn't warmed the sidewalk yet, and the socialites' laughter was still hanging in the cold air when a different voice cut through it, quiet but sharp enough to still a room. Patricia stepped out through Luxor's side entrance, her apron still smelling of coffee grounds and grease, her cheap shoes tapping against the pavement. She just finished a double. Her hands were raw from the dish pit. But when she saw 5 women in fur-trimmed coats laughing at a man pressed into the wall like he was something to be scraped off a shoe, something in her snapped past patience. She didn't think. She just walked forward and put her body between him and their laughter, like she could physically block the contempt from reaching him. One of them, dark hair, cold eyes, looked Patricia up and down and said the 2 of them must be the same breed of trash, since they smelled about the same. Patricia didn't flinch. She said the only thing that smelled in that doorway was the way they talked, and that a woman could wear an entire boutique on her back and still be the poorest person on the block. That shut them up for exactly 1 second, long enough for a few brunch customers to turn and stare, long enough for one of the women to hiss that Patricia had no idea who she was talking to, that one phone call could end her job before lunch. Patricia just nodded, calm in a way that made them angrier than shouting ever could, and said she knew exactly who she was, a waitress, earning every dollar honestly. And she knew exactly who they were too, rich enough to afford the most expensive breakfast in the city, and still too poor in spirit to spare a stranger 5 minutes of basic decency. Whitney's threat hung in the air for exactly as long as it took Patricia to turn her back and walk away, unbothered, her chin level, her apron strings swinging against her hips like she hadn't just stared down a woman who could end her career with 1 phone call. She didn't look back. She had a mother waiting on dialysis money, and a little brother who needed his lunch card refilled, and she didn't have room in her day for 5 women in silk who'd never once had to choose between rent and medicine. 3 miles north, in a penthouse suite 40 floors above the lake, Yul Bakjin stood at a window watching the city he owned come awake beneath him, and felt nothing at all. He had learned, over 38 years, that a man could have everything and still wake up each morning to an apartment that echoed. The syndicate he ran generated more money before breakfast than most families saw in a decade, and every square foot of that penthouse had been chosen, curated, paid for in cash that never touched a bank record. None of it made a sound when he walked through it alone. His father had built the Ilshin syndicate on the belief that love was a liability, that a man who let himself be known could be broken through the people he loved, and Bakjin had spent his whole life proving his father right without meaning to. Every woman who'd ever shared his bed had done her research first. He'd watched their eyes flick to his watch before they ever looked at his face. He'd listened to them ask, in voices dressed up as curiosity, which properties he owned, which islands, which accounts. Not one of them had ever asked what kept him up at night. Not one of them had ever needed to, because they already knew the answer they wanted, and it wasn't him. He was 38 years old, worth more than most nations, and he could not remember the last time someone had looked at him and seen a man instead of a number. There was a knock at the door, 2 short and 1 long, the same pattern Diho had used for over 20 years, ever since he was a young enforcer assigned to protect a teenage boy who just watched his father's coffin lowered into frozen ground. Diho was 50 now, silver threading through his temples, and he was the only person alive who'd earned the right to walk into Bakjin's private floor without an appointment. He found Bakjin still at the window, and he knew, the way he always knew, that something had shifted. Bakjin told him the plan without turning around. He was going to disappear for a while, not the syndicate, not the empire, just the name. He wanted to walk out into the city with nothing. No suit, no watch, no security detail trailing 4 car lengths back. He wanted to find out once, before he died old and rich and completely unknown to anyone, whether a single person on the street could look at him with nothing to gain and still choose to be kind. Diho didn't laugh, though a lesser man might have. He'd seen Bakjin negotiate the surrender of 3 rival crews without raising his voice. He'd seen him order things done that Diho still didn't discuss out loud. And now, the most dangerous man in 2 cities wanted to become invisible on purpose, and Diho understood, in the particular ache behind his own ribs, that this wasn't recklessness. This was a man trying to remember. He was still human, before the syndicate finished erasing the last of it out of him. He warned him anyway, because that was his job. He told Bakjin that stripping off his name in these streets, even for a week, even for a day, was walking without armor into a city full of men who'd cut his throat for the rumor of what he was worth. The Biko mob had been circling for months, testing borders, probing for weakness, and a king who wandered his own kingdom disguised as a beggar was a king who might not survive to take the crown back. Bakjin listened to all of it. Then he asked Diho a question that made the older man go quiet for a long moment. Whether, in 20 years of loyal service, Diho had ever once loved him for anything other than what Bakjin could do for him. Diho didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Bakjin got the answer he already suspected. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the truth of the life they'd built, where loyalty and love had learned to wear the same coat and nobody bothered anymore to check underneath. That night, alone in a room stripped of every mirror that might remind him who he used to be, Bakjin cut his own tailored shirt to rags with a kitchen knife, rubbed ash and street dust into fabric that had never known anything but dry cleaning, and looked at the man in the one mirror he hadn't removed. Beneath the grime, the ink covering his chest and arms told the story of a childhood that had never belonged to him, syndicate marks pressed into his skin before he was old enough to understand what they'd cost him. He wondered, staring at that reflection, whether the tattoos alone would be enough to give him away no matter how convincing the rags were. Whether somewhere out there, someone would look past the dirt and recognize exactly what kind of man was standing in front of them, and whether that recognition would come from someone dangerous, or someone who simply understood pain when she saw it. He didn't know yet which one was waiting for him outside Luxor restaurant the next morning. He only knew that for the first time in years, his hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with fear of the Biko mob, and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that someone, somewhere, might finally see him, and the even more terrifying possibility that no one would. If you believe the wealthy have no right to mock what they've never had to survive, and that a man's worth was never in his watch, drop a comment right now and tell me you're standing with Bakjin before he even knows what's coming. Then hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's chapter changes everything. And if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, the kind that break your heart in one chapter and heal it in the next, the Founding Member Edition novel collection is discounted right now, includes 2 full unforgettable novels, a free audiobook, and every future release at no extra cost. Links below. Grab it before the price goes back up. He found out the answer the very next morning, though not in the way he expected, because the woman standing in front of him wasn't looking at him like a curiosity or a threat. She was looking at him like a person, and Baekjin hadn't realized until that exact moment how long it had been since anyone had done that. Patricia hadn't planned on noticing him. She'd clocked in at 5 that morning for the breakfast rush, then stayed on through lunch because Luxor was short-staffed, and the extra hours meant an extra $30 toward her mother's dialysis copay, and $30 was not something a woman in her position turned down. Her feet ached in a way that had become so constant she'd stopped registering it as pain. Somewhere between the third and fourth table of the lunch shift, refilling water glasses for people who wouldn't look up from their phones long enough to say thank you, she'd caught sight of him again through the front window. The same man from the confrontation the day before, still pressed against the same stretch of wall near the delivery entrance, like he hadn't moved in 24 hours. She told herself it wasn't her business. She had enough weighing on her without adopting the troubles of a stranger on the sidewalk. But there was something about the stillness of him that snagged at her, not the stillness of a man who'd given up, but the stillness of a man who was watching everything and giving nothing away, and Patricia had grown up around men like that. Her own father had worn that same silence before he disappeared out of her life for good, and she'd learned early that the quiet ones were often carrying the most. On her 15-minute break, she wrapped 2 heels of sourdough and a piece of leftover roast chicken in a paper napkin, the kind of food that would have gone into the trash at closing anyway, and she carried it out through the side door along with the last of her tip change, which amounted to $4 and some odd cents. She didn't make a show of it. She simply walked up, held it out, and told him plainly that he looked like he hadn't eaten, and that nobody should have to go a whole day empty on a street corner in this city, whatever his story was. Baekjin had been offered plenty of things in his life: deference, fear, entire buildings, women who mistook desire for love. He had never, not once in 38 years, been offered bread from someone who had almost nothing herself. He took it carefully, the way a man handles something he isn't sure he deserves, and when he thanked her, his voice came out rougher than he intended, because the 2 words caught somewhere in his throat he didn't know was still capable of catching. She didn't linger. She had tables to get back to. But something in the way she'd looked at him, not with pity, not with disgust, just with the plain, unbothered decency of one tired person acknowledging another, stayed with him long after she'd gone back inside. He sat down on the curb, which he never did, tore into the bread, which he never ate that plainly, and found that it tasted better than anything served on the 40th floor of his own penthouse. She came back out twice more that day. Once with black coffee in a paper cup, the coffee she'd bought with her own last lunch change, because she figured a man out in the cold needed something hot in him more than she needed to eat that afternoon. And once just to sit, briefly, on the low concrete ledge a few feet from him, taking the 5 minutes she was owed and choosing to spend it with him instead of scrolling her phone like everyone else on that street. She talked without prying. She mentioned her mother's illness in the plain, unembellished way people talk about hardship when they've carried it long enough that it no longer feels like a confession, just a fact of her days, like the weather. She mentioned her younger brother, Dante, 16 and sharp as anything, and how she was determined he'd finish school and have a life that didn't require standing on his feet for 12 hours to survive. She didn't ask Baekjin a single question about his own past. She didn't ask what had put him on that corner, didn't ask where he slept, didn't ask for anything at all, and that, more than the bread, more than the coffee, was the thing that undid something in him that had been locked for as long as he could remember. For the first time in 37 years, since before his father had ever put a gun in his hand or an obligation on his shoulders, someone was speaking to Yul Baekjin without wanting anything from him. Not information, not money, not protection, not proximity to power. Just conversation, offered freely, the way you'd offer it to anyone standing beside you. He found himself wondering, as she talked, what kind of woman gives away her last $4 to a stranger while her own mother lies in a hospital bed accumulating bills neither of them can pay? He wondered what kept a person that generous when generosity had clearly never once been returned to her in kind. It sat in him as an open question he didn't have an answer to yet. Not suspicion, just something he turned over quietly while she spoke, the way you turn over a stone in your pocket without knowing why you picked it up. She had no idea. sitting on that ledge in her worn work shoes with dish pit hands, that she was speaking to a man capable of ending careers with a phone call, ruining families with a signature. A man whose name alone had put fear into people far more powerful than the women who'd mocked him the day before. She had no idea that every small, unremarkable kindness she was offering him, the bread, the coffee, the 5 minutes of her exhausted afternoon, was thawing something in him that an empire's worth of money had never once touched. She thought she was being kind to a stranger who had nothing. She didn't know she was quietly rewriting the fate of an entire underworld. If you believe Caroline and those socialites deserve to lose everything for the cruelty they're capable of, and that women like Patricia deserve to be protected, not punished, for their kindness, smash that like button right now and stay close, because what's coming for her is going to test everything she believes about the world. She didn't yet know that the rewriting had already begun, but by the end of that week, the fate of that underworld would spill out into a dark alley behind Luxor, and she would be standing in the middle of it. The days that followed settled into something Patricia hadn't expected to want. She still worked her doubles. She still worried over her mother's chart of medications taped to the refrigerator, still counted change for Dante's bus fare, still came home most nights too tired to do anything but sit in the dark for a few minutes before she found the strength to shower. But there was a new rhythm folded into her exhaustion now. A few stolen minutes with the quiet man outside the restaurant, who never asked her for anything and never once made her feel smaller for having little to give. She noticed things about him she couldn't quite explain away. The way he stood, weight-balanced and alert, even when he looked like he was simply resting. The way his eyes moved across a street, not the aimless drifting of a man with nowhere to be, but a scan, deliberate and complete, like he was cataloging every exit before he ever let himself relax. She told herself it was nothing. Homelessness did that to people, made them watchful, made them careful. She'd seen enough hardship in her own life to know that survival rewires a person. She also watched him with Marcus, the elderly dishwasher who'd worked Luxor's kitchen for 11 years and still got spoken to by the floor manager like he was something to be tolerated rather than thanked. Baekjin never said a word about it out loud. But Patricia caught him watching one afternoon when the manager barked at Marcus for being 2 minutes late back from a bathroom break the old man had taken because his knees weren't what they used to be. Something moved across Baekjin's face in that moment, not pity, something colder and more focused, like a man committing a name to memory for later use. Patricia didn't understand it yet. She just filed it away the way she'd filed away everything else. Another small, strange detail about a man who was becoming less of a stranger every day. The trouble came on a Thursday, 3 nights after the bread, at the end of a shift that had run late because a private party had booked the back room, and Patricia had been the only server willing to stay for the extra tips. It was nearly 11 by the time she clocked out, and the alley behind Luxor, the one she cut through every night to reach the bus stop 2 blocks over, was darker than usual. One of the 2 overhead lights burned out and never replaced. She heard them before she saw them. 2 men, stepping out from behind the dumpsters, moving with the loose, deliberate confidence of men who'd done this before and expected no resistance. One of them told her to hand over her bag, her phone, whatever she had, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't really about the $20 in her apron pocket. He kept glancing past her shoulder, toward the restaurant, asking questions that made no sense for a mugging. How many staff worked the late shift, whether the owner ever came by at night, whether the back entrance was always left unlocked. Patricia's stomach dropped. These weren't opportunists looking for a quick score. They were gathering information, and she was simply the first person unlucky enough to walk through that alley alone. She never got the chance to be afraid for long, because Baekjin was suddenly there. She hadn't seen him follow her out. She hadn't heard him at all. One moment the alley held just her and 2 men closing in, and the next moment he was between them, and everything that happened after that took less time than it takes to draw a full breath. There was no hesitation in him, no fumbling, no fear. He moved like something that had been waiting its whole life for exactly this kind of moment, precise and economical, and within seconds both men were on the ground, one of them not moving at all, the other clutching his arm and scrambling backward into the dark, choosing retreat over whatever he'd been sent to do. Patricia stood frozen against the brick wall, her chest heaving, watching a man she'd fed bread and coffee to stand over two grown men like it had cost him nothing at all. He turned to her immediately, asking if she was hurt, his voice gentle again, almost pleading, but she couldn't answer right away. She was looking at his hands, steady, not shaking, not a single tremor in them, and she was looking at his eyes, which held none of the panic hers surely did. A homeless man didn't move like that. A man with nothing didn't disable two attackers in the time it took her lungs to fill once. Something cold slid through her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. She asked him quietly who he really was. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to fear pass behind his eyes, not fear of the men bleeding on the pavement, but fear of her, of what she'd just seen, of the truth he wasn't ready to hand her yet. And in the silence between them, stretching longer than either of them could afford, Patricia understood that the man standing in front of her in torn, filthy clothes was not who he'd let her believe he was, not even close, and that whatever he was hiding underneath those rags might be far more dangerous than anything those two men in the alley had ever intended for her. Tap subscribe right now if you believe Baekjin was right to handle men like that with his own two hands in that alley. And stay with me, because the truth he's been hiding is about to come apart faster than either of them is ready for. He didn't deny it. That was the first thing Patricia noticed, standing there in the alley with two strangers bleeding on the concrete behind him. He didn't insult her by pretending she'd imagined what she'd just seen. He simply asked her, low and steady, to let him walk her home, and to give him a little time before she decided what to do with what she now knew. She said yes, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was the way he'd asked, without demanding, without any of the smugness she'd have expected from a man capable of what she'd just witnessed. Maybe it was simpler than that. 3 days of bread and coffee and quiet conversation had built something in her chest that didn't unravel just because she'd learned he wasn't who he claimed to be. Whatever it was, she found herself 2 nights later sitting across from him in a nearly empty diner 2 blocks from her apartment. Rain hammering the windows so hard the whole street outside had dissolved into smeared light and shadow. He'd changed out of the rags for that night, into a plain black coat and jeans that gave away nothing about who he really was, but Patricia had stopped needing the clothes to tell her something didn't add up. She asked him straight, no dancing around it, what he'd been running from, why a beggar knew how to drop 2 grown men without breaking a sweat. And for the first time since she'd met him, Baekjin looked like a man deciding whether the truth was a gift or a weapon. He told her there were things about his life that would frighten her, things he wasn't proud of, a family business he'd inherited rather than chosen, and a name that carried weight he'd spent years trying to escape even while never once managing to set it down. It wasn't a confession so much as the edge of one, careful and incomplete, and Patricia listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold, waiting for him to close the distance between what he was saying and what he actually meant. He reached across the table and took her hand, and something in his face softened into an honesty she hadn't seen from him yet, not even in the alley. He told her that whatever she thought she'd figured out, the truth was worse and better than she could imagine, and that he needed her to hear the rest of it from him, not from the street, not from rumor, but from his own mouth, because she deserved that much after everything she'd given him without asking for anything back. He opened his mouth to say the name. Yul Baekjin. 2 words that would have ended the fragile thing sitting between them or deepened it beyond anything either of them expected. His phone buzzed against the table before the first word left him. He didn't want to look at it. Patricia watched something flicker across his face, a flash of irritation at being interrupted in the one moment he'd finally decided to be honest. But the second buzz came fast on the heels of the first, and in his world, that particular rhythm meant only one thing. He answered it without apology, and Patricia watched the color drain slowly out of his face as he listened, watched his jaw tighten, watched 38 years of careful control snap into something colder and faster than she'd seen in him even in the alley. It was Di-ho. The Biko mob had struck the family compound an hour outside the city, not with warning shots or posturing, but with real intent, real casualties, and his mother. The one person in his life back Jin had never learned to stop protecting, even from a distance, even after everything, had been in the house when it happened. He stood up so fast the table rocked, coffee sloshing over the rim of both mugs, and for one terrible second, he looked at Patricia like he was trying to memorize her face, like some part of him already knew what leaving like this would cost them both. He wanted to explain. She could see it fighting behind his eyes, the words right there, unfinished, dying in his throat because there wasn't time, because every second he spent choosing softer language was a second his mother might not survive. He said only that he had to go, that it wasn't her fault, that she needed to forget she'd ever met him. And even as the words left him, he understood how cruel and insufficient they sounded against what she deserved to know. She grabbed his sleeve once, asking him not to just disappear, asking him to at least tell her his name, and for one breath he almost gave it to her. The two words sat right there behind his teeth, the truth she'd earned 3 times over. But giving her his real name in that moment meant giving the Biko mob a thread straight back to her. A waitress with no protection, no security detail, nothing standing between her and a war she had no part in. Loving her enough to tell the truth, and loving her enough to keep her alive had, in that one unbearable second, become 2 entirely different things, and he chose the one that broke both their hearts instead of the one that might have gotten her killed. He let go of her hand. He walked out into the rain without looking back, because looking back meant he might not leave at all, and a black sedan was already idling at the curb with its door open like it had been waiting for exactly this moment his whole life. Patricia stood alone in that diner, rain streaming down the windows, coffee going cold in 2 abandoned mugs, with no name, no number, no idea whether the man who just vanished into the storm had ever meant a single word he'd said to her, or whether she'd just watched the only person who'd made her feel seen in years disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived. If a story like this one has ever made you feel the ache of loving someone you can't hold on to, you already understand why the founding member edition is worth grabbing while it's discounted. 2 full unforgettable novels, a free audiobook, and every future release included at no extra cost. Links below. This is the kind of story collection you keep coming back to. He never called. He never came back. 3 weeks passed with nothing but silence where a man used to be, and Patricia learned to stop checking her phone every hour, though the checking never quite stopped. It just moved further back in her mind, a habit she couldn't fully unlearn. She went back to work because the bills didn't care about heartbreak. Her mother's dialysis schedule ran 3 times a week regardless of who had vanished from her life, and Dante still needed his bus fare and his book fees, and grief, Patricia had learned a long time ago, was a luxury poor women rarely got to indulge in fully. So she tied her apron back on, pinned her name tag straight, and went back to serving the same tables where 5 women in silk had once laughed at a man in rags, telling herself that whatever had happened between her and that stranger belonged to a life that had already ended. She didn't know Caroline had never stopped watching her. It happened on a Tuesday, during the lunch rush, the kind of ordinary afternoon that gives no warning before it breaks a person in half. Caroline came in with 2 of the same women from that first morning, seated at Patricia's section like it was nothing, like she hadn't spent the better part of a month nursing a grudge over being called poor in spirit by a waitress who dared to speak back. Patricia served them without complaint, professional to the bone, refilling water glasses and biting back everything she wanted to say. She didn't see Caroline slip the watch into her apron pocket. During the one moment, Patricia turned to clear another table. She didn't see it because it wasn't meant to be seen. The manager found it 20 minutes later during a routine bag check, a diamond watch worth more than Patricia made in 8 months. And by the time she understood what was happening, security was already at her elbow and Caroline was already dabbing at dry eyes, telling anyone who'd listen how devastating it was to be betrayed by someone she'd tried to be gracious toward. Patricia said the truth, over and over, that she'd never touched the watch, that she didn't even know what it looked like until it was pulled from her own pocket. But the truth meant nothing against a socialite's tears and a diamond watch and a room full of witnesses who'd already decided which woman to believe before either of them opened her mouth. She was walked out through the front, past the same window she used to look through at a man in rags, past customers who stared at her the way those 5 women once stared at him. By that evening, every restaurant in a 4-mile radius had heard her name. By the end of the week, no one would hire her. The dialysis center called 2 weeks after that, gentle but unmovable, explaining that her mother's account was too far behind, that treatment couldn't continue without payment, that they understood how hard this was, but understanding didn't keep the machines running for free. Patricia begged. She called every number she had, borrowed against every favor, sold the little jewelry she owned, and still it wasn't enough, and there is a particular kind of helplessness that settles into a woman's chest when she is doing everything right, and it still isn't saving the person she loves. Her mother's body, already weakened past what it should have had to bear, gave out on a Thursday morning in a hospital bed Patricia had fought for months to keep her in. Patricia was holding her hand when it happened. She'd been holding it for hours, telling her mother stories about nothing, about the weather, about Dante's grades, anything to keep her voice in the room. And then the hand in hers went still, and the machines went quiet, and Patricia sat there in that silence, not fully understanding, for a long moment, that her mother was gone. What kind of woman does that to another human being over one comment on a sidewalk? It sat in Patricia's chest for days afterward, unanswered, because she genuinely could not comprehend the shape of a cruelty that calculated, patient enough to wait weeks, cold enough to cost a woman her mother without ever having to watch it happen. She buried her mother on money she didn't have, borrowed from a cousin who could barely afford it herself, and came home afterward to an apartment that felt too large and too quiet for one person, though she wasn't entirely alone, not anymore, though she didn't know that yet. It was almost 3 weeks after the funeral, in the gray hour before dawn when sleep refused to come, that Patricia sat on the edge of her bathtub with a test she'd bought on her last $12, because her body had been telling her something for weeks that her grief hadn't left her room to hear. She watched the 2 lines appear, slow and certain, and she sat very still for a long time afterward, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, the other braced against the cold porcelain edge of the tub, trying to hold 2 unbearable truths in the same body at the same time. Her mother was gone, and a piece of the man who'd vanished into the rain without a name was still here, growing inside her, whether he ever came back to know it or not. She didn't cry right away. She just sat there in the gray light, alone in every sense the word could hold, and understood that whatever came next, she would be facing it with no mother to call, no job to pay for it, and no father for the child except a stranger who disappeared into a black sedan and left her holding a truth he never gave her the chance to ask for. If you believe no amount of money will ever excuse what Caroline did, that cruelty like that deserves to be answered, not forgiven. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs reminding that women like Patricia deserve better than the world has given them. She had no way of knowing that 3 miles across the city, the man responsible for her silence was tearing his own syndicate apart trying to find her, because Beggar had not stopped searching for a single day since the night he'd walked out of that diner and into a war. The week since the attack on the family compound had cost him more than most people would ever understand. His mother had survived, barely, a fractured hip and smoke damage to her lungs from a fire the Biko mob had set in the East Wing, and Beggar had spent the first 10 days at her bedside by day and coordinating retaliation by night, sleeping in 2-hour stretches on a couch outside her recovery room. But even in the middle of burying the dead and securing the compound and rebuilding the perimeter that had failed her, some part of him never stopped scanning every face on every street his car passed, hopping for a glimpse of dark curls and tired eyes, and a woman who'd once handed him bread with no idea what it would cost either of them. He'd sent men, quietly, discreetly, to Luxor to ask after her, only to learn she'd been fired weeks earlier over some theft accusation that made no sense to anyone who'd actually met her. The trail went cold from there, no forwarding address, no current employer, a woman who'd simply disappeared into the same city that had swallowed him whole for those brief weeks in rags. He didn't know she'd buried her mother. He didn't know what she was carrying. He only knew that the woman who'd seen him as a human being for the first time in decades had vanished the same week he had, and the not knowing sat in his chest like a wound that refused to close. His mother, recovering but not softened by it, had her own plans for where his attention belonged, and those plans did not include a waitress from a restaurant she'd never set foot in. She'd spent her convalescence pressing him. Gently at first, and then with the particular insistence only a Korean mother recovering from a near-death experience could summon, toward Min-hee, the daughter of an old allied family, poised and cultured, and in his mother's estimation, exactly the kind of wife a man in his position required. Bakjin had known Min-hee for years, had escorted her to functions when the optics of the family demanded it, had never once felt for her anything beyond a distant, businesslike fondness. He'd told his mother, more than once, that he wasn't ready, that there were things he needed to settle first. He hadn't told her what those things were. He hadn't told anyone except Di-ho that somewhere out there was a woman he'd never even given his real name to, and that he intended to find her before he agreed to marry anyone at all. Di-ho, meanwhile, had never trusted Min-hee. Not once, not in all the years she'd circled the edges of Bakjin's world with her careful smiles and her family's old money. He'd chalked his unease up to instinct for a long time, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 decades of syndicate warfare. But instinct alone wasn't enough to bring to a man like Bakjin. So Di-ho had spent the weeks since the compound attack doing what he did best, watching quietly, asking careful questions, following threads other men wouldn't have thought to pull. What he found made his blood run cold. Min-hee's family accounts, the ones her father had always described as old wealth, conservative and untouched, had been moving money for 18 months into shell companies that traced, through 4 separate layers of obfuscation, directly back to Biko Holdings. Not small amounts. Not the kind of coincidental overlap that happens in a business world where everyone eventually touches everyone else's money. This was funding, steady and deliberate, flowing from Min-hee's personal accounts into the very organization that had just tried to burn Bakjin's mother alive in her own home. Di-ho dug further, and what surfaced next was worse. A payment, small compared to the others but precisely dated, made 3 days before 2 men had cornered a waitress in an alley behind Luxor restaurant and asked questions about staff schedules and unlocked doors. Di-ho sat with that information for a long, sick moment before he understood what it meant. The enemy hadn't simply stumbled onto Patricia by accident. Somehow, someone connected to Biko had known about her before that alley, had known she mattered enough to be worth watching, had known about Bakjin's attachment before Bakjin himself had fully admitted it to his own heart. Which meant Min-hee, or someone close to her, had known about Patricia from the very beginning. Which meant the woman his mother wanted him to marry might be the same hand that had set every disaster of the last 2 months into motion. The alley, the timing of it, possibly even the diamond watch that had destroyed Patricia's name and cost her everything. Di-ho didn't yet have proof connecting Min-hee directly to the frame-up at Luxor, but the timeline sat there in front of him like a loaded gun, too precise to be coincidence, and he understood he wasn't looking at a woman playing politics anymore. He was looking at a mole, embedded at the very center of the family, close enough to Bakjin to be trusted with his mother's hand at family dinners, close enough to know things no outsider should have known. He brought it to Bakjin that night, laying the documents out one by one across the desk without softening a single figure, watching his old friend's face as each page confirmed what neither of them wanted to be true. He expected shouting. He expected the kind of controlled violence he'd seen from Bakjin before, chairs overturned, fists against walls, the release valve of a man who'd spent his whole life channeling rage into action. Instead, Bakjin went completely still. He read every page twice, set them down with a care that was somehow more frightening than any outburst could have been, and said nothing at all for nearly a full minute. Di-ho had known this man since he was a grieving teenager standing over his father's grave, and in all those years he had learned exactly one thing that never failed to unsettle him. Bakjin's silence was never absence. It was the sound of a decision already being made, final and irreversible, long before he ever spoke it aloud. And sitting across from that silence now, Di-ho understood that whatever Min-hee had built, whatever protection her family name had once given her, was about to come apart in ways she hadn't prepared for at all. The decision Baek Jin had made in that silence took 3 weeks to build and 1 night to execute, and by the time it was finished, Min-hee would understand exactly what it cost to underestimate a man who never raised his voice. He didn't confront her privately. He'd considered it briefly, the simpler path of pulling her aside and demanding answers before anyone else had to know. But Di-ho had talked him out of it with a single question. What happens to the evidence, and to Min-hee's freedom to run, the moment she realizes she's been caught? A private confrontation gave her time to disappear, to warn her handlers, to burn whatever remained of the trail leading back to Biko. What Baek Jin needed instead was a room full of witnesses, people whose social standing meant something to Min-hee's family, an audience that made denial and disappearance both impossible at once. The engagement banquet gave him exactly that. His mother had planned it for months, a formal gathering meant to announce Baek Jin and Min-hee's union to both families' full social circle. 300 guests in silk and tailored suits, string quartet in the corner, champagne towers catching the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. Min-hee arrived that evening radiant and composed, playing the part of the devoted bride-to-be with the same flawless precision she'd used for years to hide exactly what she was. And for the first hour of the evening, nothing about the night suggested it would end any differently than the 100 banquets that had come before it. Baek Jin waited until the toasts began, until his mother had stood with a glass raised and tears of relief in her eyes at finally seeing her son settled, before he rose from his own seat and asked, quietly but clearly enough for the entire room to hear, if he could say a few words of his own. He didn't raise his voice. That was, in the end, the detail people in that room would describe for years afterward, that the most feared man in 2 cities dismantled a criminal conspiracy at his own engagement banquet without ever once losing his composure. He spoke of gratitude for the families gathered, of respect for tradition, and then, without changing his tone at all, he asked Min-hee, in front of everyone, why 18 months of her personal accounts traced back through 4 shell companies directly into Biko Holdings. He asked her, still in that same level voice, whether she recalled a payment made 3 days before 2 men cornered a waitress in an alley behind Luxor restaurant, and whether she could explain to the room why an outsider with no connection to his family would have been worth watching in the first place, unless someone inside his own circle had told the enemy exactly who mattered to him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Baek Jin had ever heard. Min-hee's composure cracked in real time, in front of 300 witnesses who would carry the story into every drawing room and boardroom in the city by morning. Her father, seated at the head table, went the color of ash as Di-ho stepped forward with printed documentation, distributing copies not to embarrass, but to prove methodically that this wasn't accusation. It was evidence, bank records, wire transfers, dates that lined up with precision no coincidence could explain. Min-hee tried, briefly, to turn the room against him, to call it fabrication, betrayal, a jealous man inventing lies to escape a marriage he never wanted. But the numbers didn't care about her performance, and neither did her own father, who stood without a word and walked out of the banquet hall rather than defend her, disowning her in front of the same society she'd spent her whole life trying to impress. What none of the guests understood, what only Di-ho fully knew, was that the banquet had never been the true target. It was the opening move, timed for a reason, because the moment Min-hee's exposure hit the room, her Biko handlers would scramble, would try to move money and cover tracks before anyone official came looking, and that scramble was exactly the mistake Baek Jin had been waiting 18 months to force out of them. While 300 guests were still absorbing what they'd just witnessed, federal agents were already moving on warehouses and offshore accounts 3 states away. Armed with a decade of documentation, Baek Jin had spent years quietly assembling. Not to use himself, not for the kind of bloody retaliation his father would have ordered without a second thought, but to hand directly to the one institution the Biko mob had never learned to buy off completely. He'd made the decision weeks earlier, in that long silence Di-ho still hadn't forgotten, that the only real way to end this war was to stop fighting it in the streets entirely. Guns and blades left bodies and bred retaliation for another generation. Paper trails, delivered to the right hands, ended empires permanently, without giving the next Biko son a martyr to avenge. By morning, it was over. Federal raids across 3 states brought down the entire Biko leadership structure in a single coordinated sweep, the kind of collapse that made national news and left rival syndicates across the country quietly reevaluating their own paper trails. And buried in the mountain of evidence, Bakjin had handed over was something far more personal than headlines could capture. Documentation proving exactly how a diamond watch had ended up in a waitress's apron pocket at Luxor restaurant, exactly who had orchestrated it, and exactly how innocent that waitress had been the entire time. By that afternoon, Patricia's name was formally cleared, publicly and permanently, though no one had been able to find her yet to tell her. Bakjin should have felt triumphant. He'd dismantled an empire, unmasked a traitor, and won a war without firing a single shot himself. Instead, standing in the wreckage of his own engagement as reporters and federal agents swarmed the city, all he could think about was a woman with tired eyes and a warm loaf of bread, somewhere out there, still believing he'd abandoned her without a word. He'd won the war 3 miles from where the real battle was still waiting for him. A cold hospital hallway he didn't yet know he was about to walk into, carrying a truth about to collide with a grief he had no idea she'd already survived alone. If watching Minhee's empire collapse in a room full of witnesses gave you the kind of satisfaction that makes you want to stand up and applaud, you need to know something. The version of this story you're watching right now only scratches the surface. The full novel, written exclusively for loyal fans of this channel, goes deeper than anything YouTube will ever let us show, and it isn't sold anywhere else on this platform. It's part of the founding member edition, discounted right now, link in the description, and once it's gone from this price, it's gone. It took Diho less than a day to find her, because a cleared name leaves a trail a hidden one never could, and by that evening, Bakjin was standing outside a public maternity ward on the city's south side, still in the tailored suit he'd worn to unmask Minhee, his hand pressed flat against a door he'd crossed oceans and empires to reach. He hadn't slept. He hadn't changed. He'd gone straight from the wreckage of the banquet to the federal briefing, then straight from the briefing to the address Diho handed him with a warning in his eyes that Bakjin hadn't fully understood until he pushed through the ward doors and saw her. Patricia was sitting up in a hospital bed that had seen better decades, a thin blanket pulled over her knees, a newborn wrapped in a hospital-issue blanket asleep against her chest. There was no family gathered around her. No flowers on the windowsill, no balloons, none of the small kindnesses that usually filled a room after a birth. Just Patricia, alone, holding a baby that was unmistakably his, in a ward that smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, and the sight of it stopped him cold in the doorway in a way that no gunfight in his entire career ever had. She looked up and saw him standing there in a suit that probably cost more than a year of her old rent, and something in her face went very still, very quiet, the particular stillness of a woman who has already cried every tear she has access to and has nothing left to spend on shock. He said her name. He told her everything, right there, standing in the doorway because his legs wouldn't carry him closer without her permission. His real name, the syndicate, the reason he'd vanished into the rain that night, the attack on his mother, the war he'd been fighting in silence for weeks while searching every corner of the city for her at the same time. He told her Minhee had orchestrated the alley attack, had likely orchestrated the frame-up too, that everything had been exposed and dismantled, and that her name was cleared, fully and publicly, that she never had to explain herself to anyone ever again. He said it like a man laying down every weapon he owned, hoping the sheer weight of the truth might somehow undo the silence that had come before it. Patricia let him finish. That alone, Bakjin would understand only later, was more grace than he had any right to receive. Then she asked him, in a voice with no heat in it at all, which part of that story was supposed to bring her mother back. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one. He stood in the doorway with every resource he possessed, every dollar, every connection, every ounce of the power he'd spent his whole life protecting, and none of it meant anything against a hospital bed her mother had died in 3 months earlier, because the money to keep her alive had run out the same week Patricia lost her job over a lie someone else's cruelty had built. He crossed the room slowly, and when he reached the side of her bed, he did something Patricia had never once imagined a man like him capable of. He knelt, right there on the cold tile floor in a suit worth more than she'd made in a year, and told her he was sorry in a voice that cracked on the second word. She didn't reach for him. That was the part that broke him more than anything else in that room, more than the empty windowsill, more than the exhaustion carved into her face. She simply looked down at him kneeling there and told him evenly that sorry didn't cover the months she'd spent crying on a bathroom floor with no idea if he was alive. Sorry didn't cover standing alone in a courtroom of gossip while her name was dragged through the mud. Sorry didn't cover holding her mother's hand while the machines went quiet because there was no money left to keep them running. She told him he'd walked into that alley and saved her from two strangers, and then he'd let an entire empire of consequences destroy everything else in her life without ever being there to catch a single piece of it. He told her he would fix it. The money, the debt, whatever remained, that nothing was beyond repair now that he was here. And even as the words left him, he understood, watching her face change, that he'd said exactly the wrong thing. She asked him if he thought this was about money. She asked him if, after everything, he still believed a check could undo a grave. Her voice never rose above a whisper, but there was something in it sharper than shouting ever could have been. And she told him, with the baby still sleeping against her chest, that she had buried her mother with borrowed money from a cousin who could barely afford it, had given birth alone in a public ward with no one holding her hand, had done every single unbearable thing life demanded of her without him, and she had survived it, all of it, without his empire and without his name. She didn't need him to rescue her now. She'd already done the rescuing herself, the hard way, the only way anyone had given her the chance to. He begged her, his composure gone entirely now, asked her what he could possibly do to earn even a fraction of her forgiveness, and Patricia looked at him for a long, quiet moment, long enough that he let himself believe, for one terrible, hopeful second, that she might soften. Then she looked down at their sleeping child, back up at him, and told him, in a voice that held no cruelty and no mercy either, just to leave. He left. That was the part almost no one who knew him would have predicted, that the man capable of dismantling an entire criminal empire in a single night walked out of that hospital room without argument, without a single attempt to bend her will to his own. Because for the first time in his life, Bakjin understood that some things could not be taken, only earned, and taking had never once worked on the one thing he actually wanted. He didn't disappear again. That distinction mattered more than he could have explained to her in that moment, so instead of explaining it, he simply proved it. The first thing he did, before he'd even left the hospital parking lot, was call his accountant and quietly settle every outstanding debt attached to Patricia's mother's care. Not as a lump sum wired with his name attached, nothing that would let her hand it back to him out of pride, but structured through an anonymous medical assistance fund his lawyers set up within 48 hours. The kind of fund hospitals had genuine, unremarkable reasons to apply toward a patient's account. He did the same for Dante, establishing a scholarship through a foundation with no ties traceable back to the Ilshin name, one that covered every semester of college tuition Dante would ever need, structured so quietly that even the school counselor who processed it never thought twice about where the money originated. He wanted Patricia to keep her dignity intact. He understood, finally, painfully, that dignity had been the one thing consistently stripped from her throughout this entire ordeal, and he refused to be the one taking it from her again, even with good intentions. The syndicate took longer. Dismantling 20 years of infrastructure his father had built on threats and blood couldn't happen with a phone call or a signature, and Bakjin spent those weeks in rooms most people never saw, unwinding illegal holdings, severing ties to operations he'd inherited rather than chosen, converting what could legally survive into legitimate business interests, and quietly closing what couldn't. Diho stood beside him through all of it, watching a man methodically surrender the only kind of power he'd ever fully understood. And though Diho never said it aloud, There was something in his face during those weeks that looked almost like pride. But none of that, Baekjin understood, was the part that actually mattered to Patricia. Money could be wired anonymously. An empire could be dismantled in boardrooms. What she needed to see, what she'd earned the right to demand before she'd ever consider trusting him with anything again, was proof that he could show up, consistently, for the small, unglamorous, unrewarded work of simply being present. So he asked, carefully, respectfully, for nothing more than the chance to help with the baby on her terms at her pace. And when Patricia finally allowed it, weeks later, worn thin from solo nights and a body still healing from childbirth, he showed up not as Yul Baekjin, head of a syndicate, but as a man learning, for the first time in his life, how to do something no amount of money had ever taught him. The first night he stayed to help, their daughter woke at 3 a.m. screaming with the particular fury only a hungry newborn can summon. And Baekjin, who had once negotiated the surrender of armed men without breaking a sweat, stood in Patricia's small kitchen at 3 a.m. completely undone by a can of formula, and a set of instructions he read 3 times before he trusted himself to follow them correctly. He got the water temperature wrong twice. He fumbled the bottle nipple, spilled formula down his sleeve, and stood there in a kitchen that smelled like sour milk and exhaustion, testing the liquid against his own wrist the way the pamphlet instructed, praying he'd gotten it right this time. When he finally settled their daughter against his chest and felt her stop crying, felt the small weight of her go still and trusting against him, something in his chest cracked open in a way that Min-hee's betrayal and the Biko mob's bullets never had. He didn't bring security guards into that apartment. He didn't bring assistants, didn't bring anyone who could have made the work easier or faster. He changed diapers himself, badly at first, then competently, then without thinking about it at all. He learned the particular rhythm of walking a colicky infant back and forth across a living room floor at 4 a.m, learned which cry meant hunger, and which meant something else entirely, learned to function on the same broken sleep that had worn Patricia down to nothing in the months he'd been absent. He never once mentioned the money he'd quietly settled behind the scenes. He never used it as leverage, never brought it up as proof of his devotion, because he understood, finally, that Patricia had never been impressed by money in the first place, and reminding her of it now would only cheapen the one thing he actually had left to offer her, his time, spent plainly, without an audience, without reward. Patricia noticed. She would have had to be made of stone not to notice a man who had once owned half the city showing up at odd hours with formula stains on his sleeves and exhaustion under his eyes that matched her own, asking for nothing except the chance to be useful. She still kept her guard up. She still watched him some nights with an expression that hadn't fully forgiven him and might never fully forgive him, and she told him plainly, more than once, that showing up now didn't erase the months he'd been gone. He never argued the point. He simply kept coming back, night after night, week after week, doing the unglamorous, unrewarded work of earning something that couldn't be bought. One evening, weeks into this quiet routine, Patricia sat watching him from the doorway of the nursery as he hummed something low and unfamiliar to their daughter. Some half-remembered lullaby in Korean he barely recalled from his own childhood. His voice rough and unpracticed, but patient in a way she'd never once seen from him before the alley, before the diner, before any of it. And for the first time since that hospital room, something in her chest shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but the smallest, most dangerous thing of all. The beginning of a question she hadn't let herself ask in months, about whether some walls, built carefully enough and held long enough, might not be strong enough to survive a man who simply refused to stop showing up. That question didn't stay unanswered for long, because walls built out of grief tend to crack fastest under the weight of consistency, and Baekjin never once stopped showing up. Not that week, not that month, not through an entire year of Tuesdays spent warming bottles and Saturdays spent sitting quietly on her couch, asking for nothing more than permission to be near his daughter. It wasn't a single moment that thawed her. Patricia would tell people later, when she finally let herself talk about it, that there was no dramatic turning point, no grand gesture that undid the damage of those months alone. It was smaller than that. It was him remembering, without being asked, that their daughter hated the blue pacifier and only settled with the yellow one. It was him sitting in a waiting room during a routine pediatric checkup, filling out paperwork with the same steady hand that had once signed off on federal evidence against his own fiancée, listing his occupation as founder of a nonprofit rather than anything resembling the empire he used to run. It was the morning she woke to find he'd quietly paid off the last of Dante's textbook fees without a word of credit taking, and when she confronted him about it, he simply said that family didn't keep score, and then looked immediately embarrassed by his own certainty in calling them that. The syndicate was gone by then, fully and permanently, its illegal holdings dismantled, its legitimate assets folded into something new. Baekjin and Patricia built it together, slowly, over the better part of 2 years, a foundation that funded emergency medical debt relief for families exactly like hers had been, established college scholarships for kids like Dante who had the mind for it, but not the means, and created a workers' assistance fund specifically for people like Marcus, the elderly dishwasher who'd spent 11 years being spoken to like he didn't matter. Patricia insisted on that piece personally. She sat on the board herself, not as a formality, not as the girlfriend of a wealthy man lending her face to a good cause, but as the person who understood, better than anyone in that boardroom, exactly what it felt like to be one missed paycheck away from losing everything that mattered. Baekjin never once tried to take that seat from her. He'd learned, finally, the difference between protecting someone and controlling them, and he spent every day of those 2 years proving he understood it. He asked her to marry him on an ordinary Sunday, and that, too, was deliberate, because Baekjin understood by then that Patricia had spent her whole life distrusting grand gestures, distrusting men who showed up with diamonds and speeches and nothing underneath them. So there was no restaurant reservation, no orchestrated surprise, no ring hidden in dessert. It happened in the backyard of the modest house they'd bought together, sunlight cutting warm through the trees, their daughter chasing something invisible across the grass, while their second child, born the year before, napped against Patricia's shoulder on the porch swing. Baekjin sat down beside her, still in the plain clothes he wore now more often than any tailored suit, and he told her, simply, that he'd spent the first 38 years of his life searching for someone who could love the man underneath the money, and he'd finally understood, watching her build something real out of the wreckage he'd caused, that he'd had it backward the whole time. It was never about whether someone could love him without the money. It was about whether he was capable of becoming a man worth loving at all, and she was the one who'd taught him how. He didn't have a ring hidden in his pocket that day. He asked her first, honestly, without theater, whether she'd let him spend the rest of his life proving, every single ordinary day, that he understood exactly what he'd almost lost. Patricia sat with that question for a long moment, watching their daughter tumble in the grass, feeling their sleeping son's weight against her chest, and she thought about the woman she'd been in that hospital ward, alone, grieving, certain she'd have to build a life for her children entirely by herself. She thought about every 3 a.m. feeding he'd shown up for without being asked twice. She thought about the ring in his voice when he'd said family didn't keep score, and how he'd meant it, and how he'd lived it every day since. She said yes, and it wasn't a surrender. It was a decision, made with clear eyes, by a woman who had never once needed him to survive and had chosen him anyway, because he'd finally become someone worth choosing. Years later, the foundation carried both their names, quietly, without fanfare, funding thousands of families who would never know the story behind it, never know that its roots traced back to a man in torn rags outside a restaurant and a waitress who'd handed him bread with her last coins. Their children grew up knowing their father as a man who came home every single night, who never missed a school recital, who still, even now, hummed that same clumsy Korean lullaby when either of them couldn't sleep. Patricia never let him forget where they'd started. She kept, tucked in a drawer she rarely opened, the paper napkin she'd first wrapped that bread in, worn soft with age, a reminder of the exact moment one small, unremarkable act of kindness on a cold morning had rewritten the fate of 2 lives that had no business colliding at all. He'd searched the streets of that city looking for someone who could love him without his fortune, certain the answer would come from a stranger's charity. What he found instead was something far rarer, a woman who made him earn it, who held him accountable for every consequence of his silence, and who taught him that real love was never about being chosen despite having nothing. It was about becoming someone worth choosing, one honest, unglamorous day at a time. If you believe Patricia was right to make him earn every inch of her trust before she ever gave him her heart back, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Stories like this one deserve to reach every woman who's ever had to rebuild herself from nothing. And if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us to tell it, the Founding Member Edition is still available at its discounted price. 2 full unforgettable novels, a free audiobook, and every future release included, written for people who understand that real love has to be earned. Links below. Don't let this one pass you by.